Hey friends, welcome back to the channel and part 2 of making your own sounds with synthesis. In today's live stream, I'm picking up where I left off last week in part 1, where I showed you the basic building blocks of synthesis. Today we're diving deep into the next essential skill on that path, and it's modulation. This is what brings your sounds to life. We will cover everything from sources to destinations, and I'll show you how it all works together. Learning to craft your own sounds from scratch is the key to breaking free from preset dependency and developing your own truly distinct musical voice. So imagine if you were able to sit in front of any synthesizer, doesn't matter if it's hardware or software, and know exactly how to navigate your way around and start creating your own sounds. So feel free, as always, to drop any questions you might have in the chat. We'll hang out, have fun, and discover some new things along the way. And as always, my goal here on the channel is to help you become a better music producer. So without further ado, let's dive in. Also, with the chat, do let us know how you're doing. Say hello if you are tuned in and joining in the live stream. Be nice to know how you are and how you're doing. All right, so let's do a little bit of a test or two. We should already have a microphone loud and clear. Obviously I do pre-test everything, but you never know. So if someone is there that can confirm that at some point, that would be great. The microphone's all good. Just going to play a little bit of audio here, a track of mine, some unreleased music, just so we can test those meters as well. We'll jump to the meat and potatoes. Nice. Well, that looks all good on my end. Hopefully all good your end as well. We'll keep a limiter on the master channel that's just there if we need to juice up our audio a little bit as we go along. So maybe we can start with a little bit more building on what we're doing today. As I said, we're part 2 of learning your way around synthesis and how to make your own sounds with it. We're tackling modulation, which I think is a pretty fun subject to dive into. Let's have a look just before we do that, just a little recap. So we're just going to jump from the screen share. Actually, we were already there, by the way, so we're already on the image I just noticed over there on YouTube. So what you can see, so I'll just bounce back, that's what we were just looking at and just messing around with here in Ableton Live. So let's just bounce over to there for a second. This is a little recap. So this is actually available below last week's part 1 video as a free PDF. And literally all I did here with this kind of mind map is turn it into a map of the different types of synthesizers we have in the locker of Ableton Live's instruments and what they kind of excel at, what they're kind of built to do, and what other types of synthesis they can do. So if you kind of look your way around here a bit, you'll notice that some of these synths, they're a bit more versatile than one type of synthesis. So we can also look at that a little bit today. That is a bit more about types of synthesis, what they do different to each other and how they sound different. But first I want to break down modulation. If it turns out we don't get into, you know, Wavetable, FM, bitimbral too much, well, we can come back and take a look at that perhaps in a part 3. As I said, obviously synthesis is a deep subject, but this little PDF, handy little chart, grab yourself a copy if you like. It's a free PDF in my previous week's live stream. Now, a little bit of fun here. The next slide that I'm going to show you, kind of my humor. Maybe some of you may or may not find the same humor funny, but literally this is the graph progress of last week's video on YouTube. And I have to say, once you've looked at a lot of ADSR envelopes, you can never look back. And what does that look like? The statistics for the graph of the views of last week's YouTube video, it looks exactly like a pretty decent ADSR envelope of an interesting sound, a very common, almost a common shape for synth sounds. So as I said, once you've seen ADSR, You can't turn your back on it. You're going to see it everywhere in music. That's the shape of an envelope. Thought it was kind of funny. I think the universe must be speaking to me somewhere there, realizing that I must have made a video about envelopes and talked about those things. Anyway, thought it was amusing when I saw that. So there's a little picture of that. And then finally moving on here before we get stuck in, there's a very interesting video put together in recent times. It shows here on the slide, it was 11 days ago when I took the screenshot, by Venus Theory. Now, maybe some of you already know him, musician, producer, YouTuber, great content creator, sound designer, plugin designer, does all sorts of things within the world of music and electronic music, and he often digs into subjects that not others are willing to speak about. Anyway, he went in depth into a video about copyright issues and potential issues using music made by AI. It's a great watch. I'll put a link to it in the description below once today's stream is done, so you can go and check it out for yourself. Shout out to Cameron, great content on his channel. Why have I brought that up here and showed a screenshot of it? I think the funny thing is that when I watched that and then realized what I'm trying to do for you guys and girls out there, breaking down how you can make your own sounds with something like synthesis, I think that's becoming more important, especially when we look at something like Cameron's video and understand sort of where our rights might stand if we're all using the same sample and everybody else has it in their track, and then someone copyrights that track, and then maybe you've got the same sounds, right? And then you're suddenly in conflict with what they have in their track as you use the same sample. Now, Splice has a bit of a system going with that, where you can get the certificate for the sounds that you download from Splice, so that you are, and they have interesting licensing contexts that I won't deep dive into today, but essentially other people can legally use the same sample as you. And so you should always look into things like that and make sure you understand what you're using and putting in your track. But of course, if you make something, which is what I'm tying it back to today, that's unique on your computer and it belongs to you and you've created it from zero, then by all theories and accounts, we probably should avoid a lot of these issues. So this might become very important in the future, looking at where we're currently at and where this might go. If you've got any thoughts about that, do drop it down in the chat there. I'd be interested to hear what you think. Anyway, Cameron's video, copyright claim by Suno, AI copyright claim, my last video, great watch, interesting stuff. Thought I'd show you here and thought I would tie that into, as I said, what maybe is another important layer of going about making your own sounds. All right, so we're going to go back to screen share now, get into Ableton Live, and we're going to start talking about today's main topic of modulation. Now, what is the definition of modulation? Well, modulation can simply be translated as change over time. How does it, we're probably already familiar, I think most people are more familiar with automation than modulation. And so given that modulation can simply be translated as change over time, how does it differ from automation? I think the main difference is that automation is generally pretty static, right? So what do I mean by this? Let's do a fast example here where we just perhaps grab something like one of our instruments here, just so we can literally put a little MIDI clip in. And we're not going to do anything really sophisticated here. Let's even make it a lot shorter than that. So we're just going to end up with one bar here. And let's put a chord in there. Simple triad. We might make that legato so it goes all the way across here. Or let's just drag that all the way across. Okay, so we've got a held triad here on this Wavetable track. Let's loop that. Actually, now we've got the full length here, so let's also bring that right on in to one bar here. Okay, let's just test that we can hear that. All right, so maybe we will consolidate it a little bit over a couple more bars, just so we've got a little bit more to play with. Maybe we'll actually do it for 4 bars here. And then what we might do here as well is not have it re-trigger, so we'll stick it together as one big chord that goes for 4 bars now. So what is the difference between sort of automation and modulation? Well, modulation and automation. So we can virtually do modulation with automation. And one way we can do that, it would be an example of taking the filter frequency here on this wavetable and selecting it as an automation source. So let's just check. We'll go in here and we'll just ask it to show all parameters. Let's click down here on the filter. So there we have the filter frequency. And what we could do is go in here and sort of highlight part of the automation lane, right-click down the bottom here, choose something like a sine wave shape for the filter frequency, and then go ahead and sort of copy that right across down the bottom here. Okay, so this is going to virtually recreate a sort of more of a feeling of modulation. That is, it's going to move that filter frequency knob up and down as we've drawn here with the sine wave shape. So it's wobbling that filter frequency, okay, up and down. But the issue being that if you use automation to do that, rather than modulation, which we'll dig into a moment, we've actually taken over the absolute control of this filter frequency at the moment, right? So if we are to move the frequency knob and say, oh, well, actually, we'd like it to open up as a ramp over time, as well as that wobbling movement, we have a problem because we've just disabled the automation. So this is, for me, a bit of a wasteful way potentially to use automation, because I could modulate the filter frequency to do this sine wave movement, and I could then also take over the automation of, as I suggested, where we go for a more traditional, so let's say we delete this and we actually just have our filter being automated in the sense that it's going to rise over time from a closed filter to an open one. That's a typical automation move. But it's very static. It's something you might do over time in your track, particularly when you're building up tension release, arranging your track, automation. So you can do some modulation type maneuvers with the automation, as I've just sort of demonstrated here, particularly by copying and pasting some of these typical waveform shapes here. But like I said, be careful, because if you choose to do that, then you will have this issue, as I said, of taking over the parameter, unless it's something where, you know, we could, there is a workaround. We could, instead of automating it here, we could use an LFO. So perhaps I'll just quickly show you that. There is a bit of a disclaimer to that, but that's almost brand new in Live 12. Not something that we've had for a long time access to. That is, if we do this a different way, and that is mapping an LFO to the filter frequency, we can again have it cycling, but we can actually switch off the mod and have mod or remote. So when it is in mod mode, as you can see here, the LFO is modulating the filter frequency of the wavetable, but we can still open and close the parameter. So if you added an external LFO like I've done, you could do the 2 stages. So we can wobble it and have a ramp. So it is possible, but as you can see, it's a workaround. It's not something that's sort of automatically going to happen. And yeah, you know, as I said, we haven't, if you're working on 11 or previous versions of Live, we haven't had access to this option to have remote or mod on the LFO when we map it to something, but now we do, which is pretty cool actually. But as I said, just wanted to point out there that automation generally is fairly static and modulation is about movement. So that's kind of where we're starting at today. Understanding modulation can simply be translated as change over time. Now we've sort of explored a little look at how it differs to automation. So I'm just reading some notes that I put here of all the powerful features of modern DAWs. Modulation has emerged as a critical tool. Use it to craft dynamic sounds that with a mind of their own. And so there are two main sources of modulation, and that's where we're going to begin next. So let me just do a bit of housekeeping here. We don't need any of this stuff here. By the way, if you are joining me in the live stream here, if you're already in here, do say hello, let me know how you're doing, and if you've got any questions, as I said, feel free to shoot them in the chat. All right, so let's undo that. Let's filter that up a little bit, and let's jump over here to the browser and to the session view. And let's start with kind of a little bit of a comparison or two. So again, I can actually get rid of my audio track here, which is my track just to do a test at the start of today. So let's have a look at the analog synth from Ableton Live. And we're going to do a little comparison in a second to the meld, okay, the latest. So we're looking at sort of, I'm not sure if analog is any older than operator. I think both of those are kind of your OG original synths from Ableton Live. So we could have either of those, but let's say analog as one of the most original synths and the one that is modeling analog synths, hardware original analog synths. Let's do a comparison with that to the meld, which is the latest and newest synth in the Ableton Live locker, capable of a lot. And particularly, we're going to look at these two in comparison in terms of modulation. As I said, that's the topic of today's conversation. So typically, when we're speaking about modulation, we've got sources, and that's not ketchup or mayonnaise, sources and destinations. So first of all, what are the sources typically that we have to do modulation with? They are quite simply envelopes and LFOs. Now, last week in part one of learning the building blocks of synthesis, we learned about the amplifier envelope, the amp envelope, and also the filter envelope. So we've also already experienced envelopes, how they kind of work, that they work when a note is on and off, that they unfold over time, and that they can be mapped to things. Sometimes they're automatically connected to things in your DAW or your instruments, and sometimes they're not. So I did point out last week, I love when I buy a VST synthesizer or a hardware one, the more options I have for modulation. For me personally, that's a great thing. So if I have 3 envelopes available to use how I wish, or 3 LFOs to use how I wish, the more the merrier on my side of things. So envelopes, LFOs, those are 2 of the common sources that we're going to be dealing with today. Now, we could find some others. I think pigments is a really interesting example of an instrument that, let's open up our friend Pigments here, take a little look around. Pigments, down the bottom here in the modulation section, comes with a couple of envelopes that are spare here, envelope 2 and 3, envelope tied to the VCA, so that's the envelope tied to the amp envelope. That's an automatically signed one, and then we've got 2 and 3, and they can be essentially, again, modulating anything we like, pretty much. No rules, right? And so we can apply what happens when what happens over an envelope with attack, decay, sustain, release. We can apply that on all sorts of fun different parameters and things in our synth. The next thing we've got here in Pigments is an LFO page, and we've got 3 of them. Pretty cool. Again, they're not really tied to anything automatically. We can tie them to whatever we want. Thing where Pigments continues to get quite interesting is it also has this function page. This is another type of modulation here that we could explore, but you're not going to find this in every single synth. And what's kind of cool about this, I'll just remember where to go through the different presets. And there's actually 3 different function meters here, down here. And so this is where things get really interesting with the Pigments, as I said, we've got this whole other sort of modulation page here that is really interesting for more advanced types of modulation, and what we call sequence modulation, which is definitely another type of modulation, but you're not going to find that everywhere. We're going to try and keep today basic, but if you'd like to see an advanced one where we dig into these, then like I said, this series of beginner synthesis to professional can be ongoing without any issue whatsoever. So that's a quick look at pigments, and just to show you that it has, its own other sections on top of the two modulation sources we're dealing with today, envelopes and LFO. So back to analog. If we look at analog, we understand that we've got envelope tied to the amp, and we have an envelope tied to the filter. And so we don't actually, in the world of analog, the analog synth here, in Ableton Live's Locker, we don't have spare envelopes that we can just say, hey, we want to use them wherever we want. The two envelopes in the analog are tied to two sections of the synth. There is a third envelope as well, and that's living on the oscillator section, and that's a pitch envelope, which is this envelope here. We also did look at that in part one. Very end of the video, I started making some kick drums just to mess around a little bit and see what we could come up with, and the pitch envelope was pretty important for that. So pitch envelopes can be great for drum sounds, also bendy kind of basses and leads, and coming up with a nice little envelope change of moving up in pitch or moving down in pitch as, again, the note is triggered and the sequence of the envelope starts. So analog, pretty basic. On the envelope side, they're both dedicated to sections of the synth, and again, that's a common thing. We're looking, this is our VST, our emulation of real-world analog hardware synths. That's how they began. LFO-wise, we have two, 1 and 2. They're not switched on by default, they're off, but we can obviously turn them on. So we've got two LFOs. They are not currently tied to different sections, but in the moment we're going to see where we could use them. Okay, so let's then say we love modulation. What might we have if we look at something like the Meld, which, like I said, is the latest and greatest, or the newest edition in Ableton Live's Locker in 12. So if we look at Meld, and what I really like about Ableton and a lot of synth designers these days is they're giving us a matrix, a modulation matrix that we can kind of, it's almost like playing Battleships if you ever used to play that game as a kid, or somewhere through your life where you line up this A with this B and what happens when we arrive at that box. So matrices are kind of quite, I think, intuitive as to mapping things to where you want it to go. So if we look at Meld and we blow up this little arrow with the diamonds inside it, or triangle, you can see here, this is what we're faced with. We're faced with this crazy looking interface of all the different modulation possibilities that could potentially go on in designing a sound here in this synth. And if we look a little bit along each section, let's say we just pick on A, which is oscillator A here. We've got two envelopes. We've got an amp envelope just down here in the synth. We've got a modulation envelope, which again is not tied anywhere in particular. So it's essentially a second envelope that we can map to where we'd like. And then we've got this really pretty sophisticated LFO section. I've never seen one like this before, in the sense that we've got virtually two LFOs. We've got LFO2, which works kind of like a very traditional LFO. It's just down the bottom here. And then we've got LFO1, but we've got this LFO1FX. And so those two are kind of linked, and they actually almost start a process that's quite nice to do, which is where you modulate one LFO with another one. And so we can kind of almost already do that directly in this synth. And then we go on to oscillator B, or the section B of the Meld, and we can see that we've got all that again. So all the bells and whistles we could ever wish for modulation-wise, pretty much. Spare envelope, couple of LFOs, an interesting LFO, this FX LFO. We're going to look at it in action in a bit. Very, very interesting indeed. So what about one more example? Well, let's say the Wavetable, sort of released somewhere in between, obviously the analog and the Meld, and that has again, a matrix, which is really nice. And so it's kind of a little bit smaller here, but again, we can again blow it up if we wish and go through to the different pages of depending on what we're wanting to look at. So you can see it's changed a bit here now. Doesn't really, if I remember right, because I don't use this function to, yeah, so they are here, right? So we can see the two oscillators, and down here we can see the two LFO pages and the envelopes. So Wavetable, two spare envelopes, two LFOs. Fantastic. Lots of possibilities here in the Wavetable. So you can bring that up, check it out all together like that. So hopefully that kind of helps you have a little look at that discussion is the part that we're learning today of the sources, right? So the sources we're working with today, envelopes and LFOs. What is an LFO? Well, an LFO is not a low-flying object, which we used to talk about as kids. It's a low-frequency oscillator. So yeah, it is an oscillator, just like our sine wave, our wavetable, our square wave, our noise. It's an oscillator. It generates an oscillation of frequency, but it's LFO, low frequency oscillator. So it's so low, we don't hear it. It's not an oscillator we can use somewhere else in the synth to hear it. It doesn't make sound, but it makes an oscillation that we can use to map other parameters to move to that oscillation, right? So that's the one unique thing about an LFO, is we can't hear it. And so it's the kind that their frequencies are too low to be audible, but we can use control other stuff. So again, that comes back to the history of synthesis and analog, and originally that would be a voltage creating that LFO. In our virtual world and synths that we're in, well, it all happens under the hood of a plugin. So now we know our two types of sources, so we can kind of cover those, envelopes, LFO, and the source. What is next, just before we move there to destination, the one thing we want to clarify as well, because LFOs is new today from part 1, generally envelopes, so if we remember our friend pigments, let's jump over to pigments for a second, and let's hold a note. Remember about our cycle of the amp envelope, the amplitude envelope, what's going on over time when we push a key and we go through the attack phase of the envelope, the decay, the sustain. So if we bring the sustain down a bit more, we get a bit more of the decay as well. So that's our envelope. And so envelopes are what we call momentary modulation. It's happening when I push that key, and when I let go of that key, it's gone, right? So it's momentary. LFOs, on the other hand, are not like that. They are cyclic. They're going to cycle continuously. When they're attached to something, they're not going to go away. They're going to keep cycling. So let's do, why not? We're here in pigments for a second. Let's take a quick look at that. So if we've got, let's say, the filter envelope attached to the filter frequency here. So let's also just bring up our wavetable position a bit. Just so we've got a sawtooth, and let's bring our filter down a bit. And let's grab envelope 2, our friend over here, and let's assign that to the filter cutoff. And now we've got, when we're pushing our key on our keyboard, we've now got the filter opening and closing, this filter frequency opening and closing depending on this envelope shape. Let's slow the attack a bit. Let's make it a bit faster. Let's make it a bit pluckier. So that's what happens if we put an envelope on the filter frequency, right? It's momentary. It's happening when I'm pushing my key, when I'm releasing. The envelope is opening and closing, again, depending on what values we have in our ADSR envelope, how that's set up, and how long we're holding the key for and releasing it. By the way, if you are here in the live stream, do say hello. Let us know how you're doing. It's a Sunday afternoon here in Ibiza. I hope you're having a nice weekend, and I hope you're enjoying the content here on the channel. I hope you're finding it beneficial. All right, so instead of the envelope, let's do a little bit of a change. So we're going to remove the filter envelope from being assigned to the cutoff, let's instead, we're going to go for an LFO this time around. So let's take LFO 1 and let's assign that to the cutoff. So pop that on the filter cutoff. So now you can see, I'm going to hold both hands up. I'm not actually pushing a key at all, but the filter frequency is opening and closing. So that's going to keep going on unless we do something about that and don't have that particular rate, or we slow it right down. So if I speed this up, you'll see the filter will slow. Sorry, I'm going in the slow direction or speeding it up direction. So I'm on the wrong LFO, that's why. Help if I'm on the right one. So now you can see my filter frequency speeding up as the LFO is opening and closing. So let me hold a note. So we've got that cyclic motion going on, and that's quite different to momentary. Of course, it's kind of like stopping when I let go of the note, but if I had a note in the piano roll, it would still be playing, right? So it's got this cycling action as opposed to the envelope happening over time as the note is depressed and then released. So yeah, that's something that's important for us to understand. There are a few disclaimers. There are, as always, things that can happen unique to more advanced methods where we can have looping envelopes and some things that kind of actually work. Mainly envelopes. I can think of applications or ways that we can use envelope as the source and make it work a bit like an LFO, but we'd need a looping envelope to do that. All right, so let's jump out of pigments and we can say no more need for that to be mapped there, and let's just close that out for now. Come back there in a moment. So now we want to take a look at the next thing, which is the destination. That's going to be where we can apply an envelope or an LFO. Now that we know that they're our sources, where can we apply them? Well, we've just seen both in part 1 and part 2, it's a classic move, filter, envelope, LFO on the filter, both on the frequency, shaping that when you choose to move your filter frequency up or down, you can have it with an envelope or an LFO, have some modulation of that, opening and closing, closing it down from the frequency point, opening it up from the frequency point. So we're just already dealing with one way that this can tie together. So let's look at some other ways. So destination, let's start with the analog. How do we know what is some good destinations for mapping an envelope or an LFO to? And we're not talking, as I said, anymore about ones we already know about, which is the amp envelope and the filter envelope in the analog world. So let's start by, if we look around a little bit, if we go to the oscillator section, let's start with a subtractive synth pathway like we looked at last week in part 1, where we went oscillator, built up our waveform, then we moved to the amp and shaped our volume over time. When we press the key and release it, what happens to the shape of the sound? Are we making a pad, a lead, a plucky sound, drum sound? And then we went to the filter and we shaped it. So if we start with the oscillator tab, and again we can switch one of these off, we just can have oscillator 1. Let's get on the analog here. So we've got a sawtooth in there, one oscillator passing through the filter and the amp. If we look around a little bit, we could see down the bottom here anywhere where we could potentially adjust, turn something into a destination. So if I switch on LFO 1 and I make that active, and I go back to the oscillator section of this oscillator 1, you can now see that LFO 1 is alive here. It's got a little yellow 0.00 below pitch mod, so modulating of the pitch, and we also have it potentially on the pulse width, but you can see it's grayed out. Why is that? Because pulse width, this is just a little extra here, is tied to a square wave. And so if we put a square wave, which is sometimes called a pulse, It's basically allowing us to narrow and widen the square wave shape. We can look at that in Wavetable. We can see how pulse width kind of actually changes the square wave, the width of it. It kind of can make it very narrow or very wide square waves, right? So you can, if you're in a square wave, you could modulate the pulse width with an LFO. So these are destinations. So right now, turning on LFO1 removes the graying out of those sections, means they're alive. And as I said, if we're in a square wave, then we have this option of pulse width. If we're in a sawtooth, well, that's not something we can be doing in this synth. So let's then jump over to the amp envelope. Let's have a look. So if LFO1 is off, what can we do? Well, we've got an envelope, which we know about because the amp envelope is tied to the amp section. We can see that we can actually play around with the envelope amount. So we do have some adjustment of how much envelope is being applied here to the amp envelope, to the amp section. And what else do we have? We've got two LFO sections, destinations. Again, they're grayed out, need to turn LFO1 on, jump back. Now we can move the panning with an LFO, and we can also move the level, the volume, the overall volume of this with an LFO. So there's actually three destinations here. One with an envelope, which is blue, and two in the yellow, which is tied to LFO1. If we also have LFO2 on, then we might start to see that as a possibility, but generally we need oscillator 2 on, and we might use it more on the second oscillator than we're going to. It's not going to change anything here, as you can see. So it's more to do with having a second oscillator and then changing what happens in the second oscillator with a second LFO. So let's stick to the basics. So moving on to the filter section, LFO on. What have we got? Destinations, frequency modulation, LFO1. We've got envelope. There's already an amount there. We saw that last week. That's by default. I haven't done anything. There's already an envelope applied to the attached to the filter here. Okay, similarly with resonance, we've got an envelope not applied automatically and an LFO. We're not going to do key tracking today. Again, that can come in a future video. We're just looking at the basics of LFOs and envelopes as modulation, and that's more than enough, to be honest. So if we started here to kind of play around with that a little bit, so let's say maybe what we can do a little bit here is already just come up again with something super simple. What we might do is play in something. Let's maybe just have a few little chords or something. So we might just use the metronome for a moment and do it that way. Okay, let's have a think here. Okay, try another idea. Okay, let's just see if we've got something in there we can use just for a quick bit of a chord progression. I think what happened sort of a bit earlier might be a little bit better. Let's try this loop over here. Let's give it a little bit of quantization. And maybe also we'll make them legato as well, so they... I'm going to cut off the end. Try that again. Okay, now I understood why that one was cutting off. Let's just bring that front to there. So this chord here, it's a little bit gnarly. So let's maybe just revoice it slightly. See what that sounds like. We'll also revoice this one, just so we've got something that we can mess about with here that doesn't sound too bad. Maybe we'll leave that where it is. Better. Okay, so this guy here, we're going to change slightly as well. Let's try it here. Okay, so we can work with that. So it's very raw, which is kind of what we want. We're looking here at the analog. We've just got one oscillator. Let's also maybe see about having just something that we could play with this. So let's have a look for something on that side of it. Just a little bit of drums or a bit of groove. By the way, if you're here in the live stream while I'm looking for this, do say hello. Let me know how you're doing, and if you've got any questions, do fire them in the chat here, and I'll do my best to answer them. So let's look for lots of different drums here, but maybe we'll take them from somewhere else. I'll just pop into here. We perhaps have something like these bicep-ish drums that I've kind of created here. Just for context. So I'm still not sure about this chord, so let me just fix that. Because we might use this quite a bit elsewhere in the track as well. Okay, so let's try our movement here to be different. That's a bit better. We could have just not a full 4-note chord here. That's a bit better. Okay, I can live with that for now. It's not about chords today and perfecting those, but we've got something we can work with now. So, remembering that we're sort of dealing with destinations, let me just see what happens down here. What's that message about? Okay, let's just see if we can replace that. Looks like that's a like for like, so let's just drag that into there so we don't have to look at that message coming up all the time down the bottom. Great. Okay, so we're back on track here. One oscillator, chord progression. Chave dias, muy buenas tardes. Okay, today, modulation. We're into a simple chord progression at the moment, and we are about to start our first bit of modulation. We've looked at sources and destination. So, we know here in oscillator 1 that we've got One LFO we've turned on, we've activated that, and I've walked you through the different places where you can see that we can apply that LFO. The same with envelopes, so we know that we've got a couple of places where there are envelopes that we can use, and one of them's already being used, an amount of that envelope is being used on the filter. So let's maybe shape also a little bit the amp envelope. So we just make it a bit more smoother, pad-like. Let's bring the filter down a little. So one of the first places I could go to here, so I've just adjusted like I normally would with this subtractive synthesis. I've got my building blocks, my sawtooth, I've got my amp envelope shape now, my starting point, added some sustain, added a bit of attack so it's a bit smoother each time the chords trigger, they come in, sweep in smoothly rather than being too plucky. And now that we've got our different options here, let's start with maybe what happens if we put more envelope amount on the amp envelope here. So what is happening there? So we can see that this section here is tied to panning left and right. So we can use the envelope that we've got here, the source, and we can actually make our synth already, our pads and our analog synth, pan around a bit left and right with the envelope. So it's going to go to the right a bit if it's leading to this direction. So you can hear that adds quite a nice sort of spread to it. So you can use the envelope and the shape of that to change a little bit of the panning, modulate the panning inside of here. We don't have the envelope on the level because it's tied already to the level in the analog synth, and it's 100%. That's what's happening every time we play a note, that this is controlling the volume and level of the analog synth. So we don't have access to that in this synth. Other synth we might, but we can modulate the volume with the LFO. So other envelopes, as we know, we can use an envelope on the filter. So let's play around with that a bit. Let's have a bit more filter envelope. Maybe try it the other way, so we'll put our cutoff somewhere in the middle and we'll go negative. So we're closing the filter with this envelope shape. It's opening and closing, but in this case it's closing down from the filter frequency. So wherever I leave the cutoff, it's closing this down each time a chord is triggered. So we might use pigments again just to see that in a little bit, but we've now got some movement on our filter cutoff. And while we're talking about movement, one of the things I want to speak about here is you can think of LFOs like extra pairs of hands. So when you're producing or you're performing, I've got a mouse, I've got keyboards and things here, and MIDI controllers and all sorts of things, but you can think about, wow, I can have this chord progression and a synth attached to it, and I can have all these things going on in the background, modulating, moving, and making it three-dimensional instead of one-dimensional and static. It's a huge key to unlocking the front door to having really interesting sounding instruments, right? And so I cannot stress that enough. And what I'd like to suggest as well as a tip, instead of slapping lots of effects behind your synth here, and making the synth patch sound better for delays and reverbs and extra audio effects here, try and take your synth as far as you can with modulation first to make it interesting and moving around, and maybe half of what you can modulate on the synth or more, do it. Okay, and try that and see what happens, because trust me, you will awaken the beast. And the beast is a three-dimensional beast then. We're only with one oscillator here and some chords I've played in and tidied up. That's it, but it will start to sound more and more interesting. So I'm going to go for the opening of the filter with the envelope, and maybe we can try a little bit slower attack. I'm going to keep it open so we'll get a bit more sustain here. Just checking the comments here. Adrian, YouTube just showed me your live streaming. It turns out that's really interesting. Thank you very much, Adrian. I'm glad that YouTube did that. Welcome aboard. Chavi Diaz is with us. Now we have Adrian. If you've got any questions, Adrian, feel free to drop them in the chat. We're doing modulation today. We're looking at envelopes and LFOs and destinations and sources. That's the two things we're sort of playing around with here. We might get further in as we go along, but for now we're just sort of working our way around analog first and keeping it kind of pretty basic. So here's our chords. We've now got our filter moving a bit. Been playing around with the filter envelope. That changes how that's going to sound. I think I kind of like it a more pluckier filter envelope, so it's going to open and close around the frequency a bit sharper. A little bit of attack rolled off. Now let's try some resonance with the envelope because we can. So let's bring in a bit of resonance on our filter. And let's modulate it with the envelope first. So let's bring the filter cutoff envelope down, the frequency mod down a bit, so you can hear the resonance more in action. Now this is a really fun one because a lot of people don't tend to do that, right? So there's already an interesting modulation target or destination is resonance. Ableton caps us at 4. That's how much envelope we can apply to it. +4, and we can go -4 a little bit because we'd probably damage our ears if we could go harder. So what do I mean by that? As I said, I'm just toning down the frequency, so we'll have a little envelope on that, or we can make it 0, so there's no filter envelope practically. Or it's in the middle. Let's boost the resonance. So you can hear, you gotta watch your ears when you do that. But you can get some lots of nice tones in there, and I hear Daft Punk every time I mess around with high resonance values along with acid sounds. So let's go negative envelope on the resonance. So it's not boosting the cutoff, it's modulating around wherever we leave the resonance, but in this case again it's modulating to the left and down. This is the thing with analog, we don't get any visual tools, but if we learn to use our ears and hear it first, then all the visual tools in the world, such as that our friend Pigments offers us and things like that in a moment, we can use those, but it's good always, in my opinion, to learn this in the simplified way and make sure you can hear what's going on before you see it. So we're wiggling this resonance either negatively from the value that we've set it at, so we're going down to the left with a bit of modulation of it with an envelope, with this envelope, or we're opening it up from wherever we've set it. Okay, let's have a bit of envelope on the filter now as well together. Let's change the envelope around a bit so we can hear kind of what it's doing to both those targets that we've applied it to. So now it happens fast. The envelope is applied as soon as the chords get triggered. So every time one of these chords start, you'll hear the envelope kick in, right? That's the filter envelope and the amp envelope. They're happening when that starts. Right, okay, so if we roll off the attack here on the filter envelope, it's coming in, but it's coming in a little bit later. So if we listen carefully, it's sort of about here now. Right, so the more we roll that attack off, the more that's going to continue to push that back. Nice. Right, so that's what you want to kind of keep in your mind here, that envelopes are momentary. They're all to do with like chord starting, chord ending, then moving, in this case, the filter open and closed around the frequency value we've set, the cutoff of it, and also the resonance. Adrian, I'm a beginner and always thought that using filters was a logical step to sculpting the sound without overloading the CPU with extra effects. Great, good approach. I think most people, if you have a synth in front of you, the target I think we all reach for straight away is the filter cutoff there, you know, to bring some interest into the sound and open and close that. Great target for automating. No effects involved, right? We can make our sound dark, bright, wiggle around a bit, open and close, but now as you start to add some modulation to it, well, you can still open and close the filter frequency, but we can have all these lovely things like LFOs and envelopes also wiggling that around in our patch. So we could now automate this frequency knob to open and close, but the modulation is going on in the background. So yeah, that's a good point there. I think perhaps you came into the room as I was speaking about, you know, trying to modulate heavily your patches instead of applying lots of effects. I think you can really learn a lot about this by doing that and setting it as a bit of a challenge, and try and modulate half the things in the synth before you go and whack your, as I said, reverbs and delays and all the fancy bells and whistles effects. Now that could be another video another day. We've done a couple on the channel already about audio effects. Great, but this is something that is really valuable to learn, and it's going to make your sounds come to life. We're making this sound from zero here. We've started from scratch, no presets. So I want a sharper envelope on the filter. Let's move over to the analog side of the oscillator side of the analog. Well, I don't have any envelopes there apart from the pitch envelope, but I can't modulate it with the filter or amp envelope. So let's now start using LFO. So we've turned on LFO 1. We've seen that the destinations are in the oscillator section, pitch. Also, if we're in a square wave, we can have pulse width. In the amp section, we can apply the LFO again to panning. We can apply it to level, and we can apply the LFO to the frequency and the resonance, right? So let's reset things a little bit here, and we'll now listen to what the LFO does. Or what we could do actually, why not do that? We'll duplicate the whole track over, and we'll make one with the envelope applied. So we'll leave that one. And it's just one oscillator at this moment in time. So let's say we leave it like that, LFO turned off. And then we'll try over on this one to do some sound design of the instrument with the LFO. And of course we can combine the two. That's absolutely on the card. So we could have a third model here, but let's just try this so we can compare a bit. So I'm just going to reset things a little bit. Filter envelope is about 4 normally. Turn off the resonance envelope applied to the resonance. Let's open our filter up a bit. Tone the resonance down a wee bit. Okay, so let's start with an LFO and let's check what we've got going on here. So LFO 1, we've got it in currently frequency mode. So LFOs are generally going to allow you to note sync them, that is to a beat division or a note synced value, or leave them in frequency and hertz. That's what that is at the top here. And then the rate is how fast or how quickly we're going to move the LFO, right? So if we go to the left, you can see our waveform over here slowing down that cycle of oscillation. And if we go to the right, well, we can speed it up to super fast. So let's put it in the middle for now. Well, let's look at what else we've got. We've got the option to change our waveform from a sine to a triangle to a rectangle. We've got 2 noise types. And we can see a little bit along here that we've got a few other options as well. We probably won't go too crazy on more advanced things we can do with the LFO. Perhaps we can unpack that later in today's video, but we can just do the basics for now. So let's say we start with a sine wave, nice smooth curve. Let's have it in frequency for a moment, and then we'll try it in note synced as well. So let's have a listen to what goes on. So let's apply it to the pitch. This is going to be pretty wild. So let's say we bring a bit of LFO onto pitch, LFO1 onto the pitch. Right, but if we have a small amount of that, just a really small value, starts to sound like an old cassette tape that isn't doing too well, or a VHS tape or something like that. If we slow the rate down, we can make it really subtle. And if we go fast on the rate, well, that sounds nice. Let's go back over. So just a little bit of that. Now, some of you out there, maybe in the live stream, could have a little quiz on this. What is pitch modulation called? What is the term for modulating the pitch? Like a person, when they sing, their voice does a movement like this. It's a natural part of our voice when we're singing, and many instruments do this. So there's a technical term for that. If you know what it is, stick it in the chat. I'll let you know in a moment. But essentially, I'm doing that by applying a pitch, an LFO, to wobbling the pitch with a sine wave. We are creating the same thing that happens with a person's voice, a singer. Okay, so that's a classic sound in music, that sound. Now the interesting thing is, yes, Adrian, 10 points for Adrian there, 10 out of 10, vibrato, right? That is the technical name for pitch, vibrating the pitch is vibrato. Now the interesting thing with analog, and this you'll also find in a lot of synths, is if we go to oscillator 1, we can modulate the pitch with an LFO and a sine wave like we've done. But if we do reset that to 0 and we look across a bit on the analog synth, it actually has a vibrato panel. And you sometimes find this, so we don't actually need to use up an LFO, applying it there to do vibrato directly on an analog. So if we turn on this little panel here, of course you get less information, you just get vibrato percent, how much, and you get a rate. You don't get to change waveforms or anything like that. So there are differences, right? This is basic, but it's already going to do it. So if we push play, so a little bit of vibrato can be really nice. The difference, as I said, you've got a go-to on the analog where you don't have to sacrifice an LFO and dedicate it to the pitch and modulate it. You can go straight there and turn on the vibrato, but we can, as I said, go back and use our sine wave. Now, what do I mean about sacrificing it? Well, the thing is, once I turn on LFO 1 and I set a waveform and a rate, it's going to be that same setting wherever else I apply it to LFO 1. So in the case of analog, we've got a little bit of a restriction there. So if I perfect my pitch modulation with this LFO, whatever I've set it to do, so what am I speaking of? If I use it, this setting that I have here now, if I go to something else and I apply that LFO somewhere else, I'm restricted, and so if I start adjusting that LFO, I'm also adjusting wherever else LFO 1 is applied. So just keep that in mind. There are, again, ways we can work around that. Of course, we can go over to Ableton, get into the audio effects, grab ourselves an LFO that's an extra one and put it outside here, and then map it where we like using an audio effect LFO that we map around. So we can kind of work around it. It's not game over, but that kind of suggests to me if I want a bit of vibrato, I'll probably just use that panel in the analog so that I can get my LFO 1 going elsewhere. So let's now take our LFO 1 and move away from the oscillator section and have a look at it in the amp section. So we know we can apply it to panning here. So for example, this is where we have to be a bit thoughtful about how we're going to sacrifice the LFO. Now we can turn on 2, as I said, and you can have your second LFO, but then you'll notice that I don't see LFO 2 here until I turn on oscillator 2. So at the moment, that's not really giving me extra LFOs for this one oscillator I'm working with. I'd probably, if it was me, I'd probably do some mapping over here and keep myself, I'd use some LFO on my most important thing, this LFO 1, and set the rate and the waveform and everything on my most important target. And then if I've got others, I would start using the LFO. But remember, we've got envelopes as well. So we could, as I said, decide where we want the LFO most importantly. So let's carry on with that a little bit. So we know that we can wiggle the panning with our LFO. So right now it's quite fast. So if I slow down my sine wave a lot, it sweeps the sound left to right. And if we to change from frequency to note sync, we could decide in here where it now says quarter note to have a bigger value, and now it's every 2 bars. And that's really nice. I've still got my vibrato over here. I can have a bit, my envelope's still on my filter. It's not on the resonance, but we could bring that back. So as you can see, you can start to build up a way more interesting sounds using combination of those tools. Okay, so let's carry on just so we understand what our envelope is doing. It's going to reset the filter envelope amount and the resonance. So we might, I definitely think I'll use a bit of envelope on the resonance, definitely on the filter. So my filter envelope is going to be working in this patch. Bit of vibrato is nice. As I said, it can be subtle, it can be stronger. The LFO, haven't found my favorite destination for it yet. Panning was interesting, and as I said, that could be the decision. Sweep it left and right, have that nice and slow 2 bars. You can also have level, so we can see that we could apply LFO 1 to level. Now, Adrian, if you're still there, here's the second quiz, or Chavi Diaz or somebody else. Let's go LFO, let's change to a square wave. So in this case, rectangle in here. Let's make it back to frequency, and let's make it fairly fast. We might even speed it up a little bit. So we've now got our LFO shape as a square wave, and we've got our rate in hertz frequency, and we're going to go back to the amp and we're going to apply LFO 1 to the level of the amp section. Okay. And let's speed this up now, the rate of that LFO. Let's maybe note sync it for a second. Okay, so the quiz question here is, like we applied modulation before to the pitch, and that has a technical name in music, vibrato, something we're going to come across all the time, that's modulating the pitch. Singers do it, guitar players, real instruments, and in the synth world. So we've got a dedicated section for that. Happy days, don't have to sacrifice an LFO, and we've got that going on. Now we've applied an LFO to the amp section, and we're modulating the level, the volume, essentially, output of the amp envelope with a square wave LFO shape, and we're currently 8th dotted notes. What is that technically called? So that has a name. When we modulate and wiggle volume, what is that called? Okay, so just looking down, Adrian's in the game, he's answering the questions. The square wave is basically turning on and off the oscillator, correct? Not the oscillator, the amplitude, correct. It's kind of wobbling that, so that's good, and it has a name. The same as vibrato, there's another technical term that we use for that, and again, it's going on in music all the time, and it's a great thing to have going on in your patches. It makes static patches sound way more interesting. Any clues? I'll leave it for a second. If you have a clue, you can throw it in the chat there. Yes, yes. So Adrian, 10 out of 10 again. I'm sorry I don't have a prize to raffle today. Maybe another day I will. But yeah, exactly, tremolo. So I actually had them up here, by the way. They're written on the track that says sequence. So yeah, tremolo and vibrato, two things we should be dealing with often about modulating and getting some feeling in our music. Loads of things are going to benefit from tremolo. Vibrato gives us that kind of wonky tape VHS kind of pitch modulation. Can be weird, can be subtle, can be more strong, can give you the feeling of a real world instrument. Tremolo gives us this kind of lovely ducking and movement of volume, and if you put that on strings and pads and sustain stuff, it suddenly starts to come alive. I mean, lots of people use sidechain and other tools. Gates, this is similar to a gate. It's gating the volume. With a square wave, it's actually gating it on, off, and so when we speed it up, it's opening and closing that volume. Prize is knowledge. Well, yes, indeed. Well done. You got both those answers bang on the nose. So you can hear this sounds quite nice, and again, it can be. So if we go all the way up to 16ths, it's pretty fast, but we can go back to the amp here and we can tone that right down, right? So it's just subtle tremolo. Nice. So we've just got that little bit of movement in there now. I'm going to roll off the attack of the filter envelope for me because it actually didn't fit quite so well with the starting of the chord. So now I think it's making a bit more sense. So we've got all this movement now. If we turn off the vibrato, turn off the LFO, you can hear how much more static we are, right? The only thing that's moving now would be the resonance and the filter. So if we turn all that off, we're right back to a very dull patch playing those chords. So that's our chords. And it's very dull. So this is what I'm speaking about. No effects are being used yet. We just go in here and we say a little bit of, something popped up in the comments there. Chavidias. We also have specific modules enabled for vibrato and tremolo. Specific modules? No, but effects, yes. So essentially, if we start dealing in effects again, which we're not really looking at today, chorus, if we bring that over as an effect, has automatically the vibrato inside, right? It's right there, and we can adjust it using an effect to post the synth and make it vibrato, 100% correct. Chorus is our friend for vibrato. For tremolo, it's actually generally in Ableton's world, you'll generally find the tremolo presets will be actually using auto pan and again using it. And what do we see in all of these effects? An LFO, essentially. So we're seeing here a sine wave set to a rate of 1/8, set to an amount. But the thing is, like I said, using the effects, great, but here we're trying to understand that you can make your synth patches more interesting and instruments more interesting right from the get-go. So it's a good question, or I'm not sure, it was a question, yes. Yes, we have an effects where we can do it always, and there's no problem at all doing it post, but we're looking here at how we can turn this boring old analog playing some interesting okay chords and make it sound way more exciting, right? That's the name of the game here. So Adrian, you're a good teacher. I'm glad that the gods of YouTube nudged me towards your channel so I could subscribe to it. Thank you for your subscription, Adrian. I really appreciate it. And thank you for your kind words as well. Hope that helps, Chavi Diaz. So back over to here, Plain Jane. Let's give it back some vibe. That vibrato is very subtle. Let's give it a little more. Let's give our filter envelope. Bit of resonance envelope. That's what gives that sharp sort of sound. So if you don't want that little sort of sharpish sound, you don't need to modulate the resonance, right? But before I start building it back how I had it, what I want to do next is kind of look at the LFO in a place that we use it a lot where we haven't yet. So we've used it also on the panning and the level of the amp section. So let's reset those. And let's go straight to the filter. And so we already have an envelope on the filter opening and closing around the frequency. Let's put an LFO on there as well. So we're going to add an LFO to this filter frequency cutoff. So let's go back over to the LFO and check what we've got. Let's bring it back to a sine for a second. Let's maybe make it 1/8 notes or quarters. So now we can open and close our filter. And our LFO is wiggling around that cutoff, and we've got an envelope as well, right? This is where it starts to get more interesting. We've got one oscillator, we've got envelope modulating, and each time the chords start and stop, and we've now got an LFO wiggling. And again, I've made it quite extreme so you can hear it, but if we bring it down to just a bit of subtle movement on that, so sometimes I like this modulation to be really strong, and other times I like it to be so subtle that it's almost not there, but it's making a difference. So again, turning everything off. It's just the envelope. When we turn everything off in the world of analog, all we have is the envelope that's applied to the filter. And as I said, that is a default connection that we have. We have changed it slightly, as in the shape of it. It's ADSR, but other than that, it's the rest of this patch is default. So as soon as we start turning these things on, the life starts to come out. So frequency cutoff with an LFO, classic combination, in combination with an envelope, can work really nicely. The LFO does its cyclic movement, wiggling the cutoff around a bit, and the envelope opens and closes. So you get two actions on the one parameter, and it can sound great. We can also add the LFO again in the filter section to resonance. Nice. Okay, so I'm just going to go now. I've basically gone through the two types of sources, LFOs and envelopes, and the destination being wherever we've been able to apply these things. I'm going to just do a little work on this sound now. I might bring in a second oscillator, might put a couple of effects on it, but in a moment, as I said, this sound will be done. And as I said, if we run out of LFOs with the analog, that is that we've tied LFO 1 to, you know, its shape and its rate, and it's where we kind of mainly want it to affect, let's say the resonance, or something, then I can always bring in an external LFO, and as I said, go ahead and use that as another LFO. We could have 10 of those behind here if we like, but we also don't even need to do that, because we can have the LFO here and go into the second page and map away to our heart's content. But the same as the LFO here, once you have your shape, rate, depth, offset, and waveform, you know, and you start mapping it, well, every time you change that, you're going to change all the other places you map it to the same waveform changes and settings. So you might need more of these if you're wanting to have lots of differences. So that's probably how I would tackle it. So let's say if we can just make this sound finally a little bit more interesting just with what we have. So I'll make a few decisions on it and then we'll see where we end up. By the way, I realized actually, I'll just hit stop here. I realized that I didn't go through all the waveforms either. Sine, triangle, rectangle, noise. The noise ones are interesting because they give us sample and hold or random. And so obviously we're then even moving a parameter not in a cyclic motion, that a sine wave delivers us a lovely smooth cycling waveform. Triangle, pretty similar. Those two sound a little bit different, but not majorly different. Square wave gives us a nice clear on-off message, right? And then the noise ones, well, there's two shapes here and they are really random, right? This one's smoothed out a bit and this one is more, you know, sharp and jagged. So those are interesting as well when you want something that doesn't even, when it changes in a random way. So now we've got our filter frequency opening and closing at the rate of a 16th with that kind of sound as opposed to that kind of sound or that kind of sound. Or so glitchy and choppy, square wave's going to be your friend. Triangle, more smooth cycling but a little edgier than the sine. Sine smooth, noise, really cool. I like that a lot because that's way more organic. I don't have control over that shape like I do with the others. So it's giving me more of a random feeling to what's happening here. So I'm applying a little bit to the pitch. I've got a little bit of this random shape on the frequency mod. Let's try a bit on the res. Just gonna put my unison back on there. So let's say envelope wise then, if we're happy with our envelope in the ends. So we can have a bit of envelope on the panning. We can have more envelope on the filter envelope. So something I might do here, for example, if I bring this external LFO into play, I might map that to the panning in the amp rather than my random waveform, noise waveform that is working currently a bit on the pitch, just a tiny amount, a bit on the frequency cutoff amount, a bit on the resonance amount. I'd like this panning to move side to side really slow. LFO2, I'd need to reroute things around quite a bit. I think if I pop into here, I could potentially change that around, but I think for now, I'm simply just going to grab my external LFO here and map that to the panning, take over that a little bit. And I'm going to slow it right down. And so we've got that sweeping around a bit. And as I said, so far no effects whatsoever. That's all of, you know, analog. 2 oscillator, 1 oscillator. I detuned the oscillators a little bit. The unison helps that as well, but they're detuned apart slightly. And we've got this nice thicker sound. I also turned my square wave down a little bit. Could also have another sawtooth, or we could also have a sine. Could also add a little bit of noise to this. And now if we reached into our audio effects and we sort of said, okay, let's have a little bit of delay after this. Sorry, reverb. Let's have a bit of raw in the mix. We've got a nice beefy analog sounding synth patch that doesn't really need too much effects, but we can go hard if we wish, but it's really working for us by itself, right? And that was kind of the goal here. So if we kind of like, you know, duplicated this track again, I think if we revisit track 6 where we just had nothing but a little bit of envelope, no LFO action, and if we switch off the envelope modulation on this one, that's what we have. So we can hear that that's giving our filter more interest in this synth, in this version of analog, but nothing else. And then we've jumped over to here. And again, if that's a bit too random for your taste, we can obviously change the LFO and we could glitch it up, or we could smooth it out, and we can bring our amount down a lot so it's subtle. So, you know, it's turned it into something completely different, with a lot more vibe and a lot more feeling. And then if we move on to, you know, another example of it, let's say we take all of our chords from the chord progression that I sort of came up with for today, or what we've sort of been doing so far, and let's give it a bit of chop from Ableton 12's MIDI tools. Okay, so we're going to make some nice little choppy chords. So that's going to change the amp envelope and a few things. So let's make a plucky envelope. So now we've got another nice example, just chopping up these chords a little bit. Crying out for a little bit of delay here. If we turn off our effects, we've still got an interesting synth patch, right? And that's the aim of the game here. We're trying to sort of show that by understanding the sources and destinations of envelopes and LFOs, we can bring to life all this kind of movement. So analog, you know, it's a really good sounding synth. It helps us kind of learn how to hear what we've been doing so far. It doesn't give us a lot of visual clues. It's very old school. It's built around the original hardware synths, and we explored it in part one, that it's our kind of go-to for subtractive synth in a way, because it follows the path of the basic building blocks of synthesis. Start in a subtractive synthesis way, oscillator, amp, filter, but now we've sort of taken that basic subtractive synthesis model of, you know, waveform, amp section, filter, and now we've modulated it and we've got no longer a static patch. And I think I've given a few examples here that if we turn off all of this stuff, you know, we're left with quite a boring sound. So essentially I've killed off my LFO and I've killed off the envelope as well. That's what we're left with. And yeah, we can automate the filter cutoff. And we are moving the panning around a little bit here. But actually, I turned it off, so we're not really hearing that. But now we hear it. Because I've mapped this LFO here to the LFO1 section of the panning, so it's wiggling the panning around. So let's maybe now take what we've been looking at so far and kind of move that forward into, didn't want to start recording, let's take our chord progression. Hopefully you guys can still handle that. We can play some other ones in a moment if we like, or maybe we'll just change the actual key and scale. So let's shift that over to the wavetable. And let's say we'll bring the kind of plucky chopped chords over, and we'll bring the sustain ones over as well. So maybe say 1 and 2, something like that. So 1 is our original chord progression, and what we might do is let's change scales, and then we'll just kind of make these sound a bit different by that. So B minor, lovely scale, one of my favorites for sure. Let's go to pitch and time, and we can ask Ableton's 12 MIDI tools again to fit to scale. So it bumps those chords, those 4 chords that I played earlier, into this key and scale. So let's have a listen to that over here on the wavetable. Let's also bring these to the same. Wait 1 second, we want B minor up here. So a bit more moodier. Okay. So let's start with the sustain chords again, these guys. And let's look at the wavetable. So the wavetable can give us a lot more visual clues about what's sort of going on with the modulation and the source and the destination, right? So we looked early on in today's video at analog, contrasting it with the meld being the latest Ableton synth, analog being one of the originals, analog being, as I said, very basic with what it offers us, meld being much more powerful in terms of all the different sources of modulation we have. Wavetable sits in the middle. Wavetable has this great matrix available to us, which makes, I think, understanding destination and source really easy. And we've got 2 free envelopes given to us, amp envelopes already set up. And we've got 2 LFOs over here available to us all inside of Wavetable. And of course, Wavetable being a different type of synthesis. So analog being the wheelhouse of subtractive synthesis, and Wavetable being a wavetable synthesis. So one of the first things, coming back to my original mind map of different types of synthesis, you want to kind of get from this. Just 1 second, I'm just going to lean forward and turn on, if I can, a bit of lighting. There we go. It's going to get a bit darker down my end in a moment. So light on the subject. All right. So yeah, wavetable. The beauty of wavetable synthesis is the wavetable itself. And so when you look at a default Ableton Live wavetable, it lands with the basic wave shapes that we can sweep in oscillator 1 through the different wave shapes that we're already familiar with inside of analog, except we actually have in between a sine and a triangle here. So you can actually have a waveform that's halfway in between it, or closer to a triangle but near to a sine, etc. Sawtooth, square wave. And we don't have a triangle in the oscillator section of analog, right? So we've got an extra waveform there that we don't have to play around with in analog. But the beauty of a wavetable synthesis is exactly what I'm doing here. It's sweeping through the wavetables. So if you go away from the basic shapes and you move your way along, as soon as you start to get interesting wavetables, well, you've then got a changing sound as I sweep around through that wavetable, such as... So as a synthesis type that we have in our locker in Ableton Live, wavetable, the beauty of it is that we can have modulation going on inside of the wavetable, sweeping through them. And again, positive values from where we are now, up and down. So I stopped at 50, I could stop at 50% right in the middle, and I could ask it to be modulated down from that value, or up from that value, or cycling around that value. So hopefully already you will probably see what the advantage is of learning modulation when it comes to the Wavetable synth. This is its wheelhouse. This is what it separates it and why you want it in your locker as a synth to use instead of perhaps analog or operator, is the wavetable, and modulating the position of the wavetable is exciting stuff. So if we go back to the basic wave shapes, we can use the analog just like the wavetable, just like the analog sine wave. As I said, we do have a triangle, which is nice, saw, and a square wave, and we could morph. Even with the basic wave shapes, right, we can morph around and it sounds interesting. And I'm just doing that with the mouse, but I'm sure if you are here with me in the live stream and you're in the chat, would that not be a good idea to do that with an envelope or an LFO? I think absolutely yes. I hope you agree. So let's say that we start off with the modulation of oscillator 1's position, right? This parameter that I'm moving here. So the great thing with Wavetable is if we click in the matrix and we click something, we will see a line highlighted related to the parameter that we've just clicked, and there are our destinations that we can now send modulation to, and here are our sources along the top. And if you want to click and see the source, you can just click on the very top of them and go directly into those pages and work on those pages, right? So let's say that we click on the oscillator 1's wavetable position. You will see there oscillator 1 position. So let's say we start with an envelope and we give 100% of envelope 2's shape, the ADSR of it, to the oscillator 1's position. Let's bring it down a bit. So when the chords trigger, the position moves. Okay, so you can kind of see that. Again, our friends envelopes, they're momentary. So that's a momentary action there. When the envelope triggers, the chord triggers, this modulates. So it's okay. I mean, it's not super fast at this point. If we go the opposite way to -100 and we put it in the middle or around a sawtooth, we can see what happens. So we're going from the saw down, right? And if we're this way around, we're going from the saw up. So we can kind of see we're either opening up from that position wherever we leave our oscillator position. So if we put it at the very bottom and we're 100 plus, it should open up towards the sawtooth. And if we bring it down a bit, so we could sort of say, let me start on a triangle and give me a little bit of saw. And then we could change this envelope for how, again, that reacts. So no sustain. The envelope doesn't stay open for long, it closes fast. Very fast, so we don't even really hear the filter envelope with a very short decay. Long decay, okay, takes a lot. We can hear that envelope happening now. Okay, let's go back, bit of sustain, bit of decay. Let's make a longer release. So it would stay really active before the next chord starts. It's not even really coming back. Whereas here, it almost goes away and returns, right? And a slower attack. So we can kind of start to sharpen up our ears and hear what that's doing. So that's an envelope moving the position here. So again, we could put 2 or 3 on that. Matrix works beautifully, but I kind of think maybe rather than an envelope doing this, it might be a bit more dynamic if I turn out to use the LFO. So I'm going to say LFO 1, which is currently like that, a sine wave. Again, set in frequency, 100% the amount of the LFO. etc. So let's say that we apply that to oscillator 1 position. So now you can see we're cycling right through the whole waveform. And if we were to slow that down or speed it up, again, we could also note sync it, so it's happening in a rhythmical note synced value. So what I like to do sometimes is I might make a decision to do that directly. I might say, okay, LFO1 on the oscillator 1 position, a certain amount like this. I've got at a half note value at the moment. And now what I can do is sort of cycle through some shapes and listen out for something that catches my ear that I like in terms of that modulation on a certain wavetable. And if we want it a bit faster, as I said, we can. Okay. That's nice. That's really interesting, right? So I now can hear what that sounds like with the LFO. And again, we've got so many possibilities here. So if we look at the LFO itself, it's now cycling through that wavetable of oscillator 1. We've got 2 oscillators, so we're only just touching the surface. We've got where it cycles from. So again, I'm not exactly at the bottom and I'm not at the top. So sometimes you can concentrate it on a certain part of the wavetable. And again, you could be negative rather than positive. So this would keep it, you know, more focused around that point. And then as far as different movements through the wavetable, we've got triangle, saw down, and that changes the feeling, right, quite a lot. Choppy, I like that. Completely random. That's probably my most favorite for the most interesting here. So this to me is the beauty of a wavetable synth, is working with the different wavetables and applying modulation to moving through the wavetable. The rest of the synth we can approach similarly to the analog, right, in terms of this is our overall amp envelope. So if we wanted, you know, pluckiness or something, we'd be in here, but it's not going to really fit the chords I've got at the moment. Or if we want really long release clashing with the attack of the new chords, we could have a long release, or we could slow the attack a bit. That could be useful here. Let's have some filter frequency. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use envelope 2 for my filter envelope, as in Wavetable it's not automatically applied. So we're going to go to the matrix, we click on the filter frequency and we're going to say envelope 2. So we're going to see visually this time what we're doing, which is that envelope, when it triggers, it's going to open the filter, which we can see here. Right, so we could ramp it up a bit. We've got LFO2 as well. So maybe we'll stay with the filter frequency for a second. We'll bring LFO2 in. We'll make it a square wave. And we'll apply a bit of LFO2 as well to the filter frequency. Okay, so now I'm going to speed up my LFO2. going to bring down the amount. So now the envelope is opening and closing the filter frequency, and the LFO is wobbling around that cutoff. Really nice sound. So you can see that you can take this quite far. And the beauty with the wavetable is we can kind of see what's going on. Maybe we have a little bit of resonance as well with LFO2, the faster square wave LFO. So we can... Right, and we're still just one oscillator here. In this case, it's a wavetable. And again, you know, if we were to cycle through some others, we can remember Saw Dual 2. There's lots of amazing shapes in here. We're still just in the basic folder, we haven't even moved to the next categories. So again, we're not using any effects here so far. We've got one oscillator, and if we were doing a blindfold test here, I kind of feel that you would probably imagine that's more than one instrument. Or if you think it's one instrument, at least you understand that it's more than one instrument. It is one instrument, but it's way more three-dimensional than it would be if we hadn't already done what we've done so far. And again, if we take this wavetable example and we duplicate it, this is just one idea with a bit of modulation. Let's move on and we'll come back to that. So let's say we stay with one oscillator. We play around with a few other things. So if I remember right, I have a faster oscillator. This is something else I often do. I have a LFO2 might be a fast oscillator of one wave shape, and LFO1 might be a slow oscillator of something like sine wave, and then I can decide where those two things can be best used. So maybe LFO1 with its sort of slower sine wave shape, maybe we'll apply that to a bit of panning as well. A little bit of left to right movement. Let's have a bit of unison. And we're not even working with other oscillators yet. We could have the sub oscillator. And we could have oscillator 2, but let's play around a bit more with some modulation possibilities here. Let's modulate around a little bit in the oscillator 1's different choices here. So we could play around with the fold, and we could have an LFO, maybe the faster LFO. So I'm modulating the fold. Let's put that back down. Let's try the warp. Nice, so we're getting some really nice movement in there. Still got a free envelope here that we've not used yet. So maybe what we could do is we could play around a bit with the amount and time globally here, which open and close the envelopes effectively of the modulation or the so you can hear this beautiful slowing down of all the modulation. Here we're sort of making everything sort of very sustained or very open. So you can see that you can actually click on those in the wavetable and they appear here in this modulation matrix. So maybe envelope 2 on the, let's try global amount. Let's try the time. Nice. Try a bit of LFO on the time. The slower one. But I think it suits an envelope actually. So if we, that's the tip of the iceberg, as I said. It's sort of like, arguably, like I said, if you're listening to that and it's a blind listening, you may well think that is a patch with 3 instruments or more than one, and there's no effects yet. This is the point I'm trying to make. The big tip is that if you really try this as a making your own sounds, that's again the goal here with these videos, is a series of synthesis videos to get you started with the building blocks of making your own sounds. Part 1 was all about that, learning the 3 main important, or 4 things: envelopes, oscillators, filters, amps. Now we're looking at modulation, LFOs and envelopes, and of course this can even keep going and keep going. We haven't looked at all the possibilities of meld when we're talking about modulation. The latest synth from Ableton, pigments from Arturia gives us all these lovely other options, such as other pages where we can do different types of modulation and different synthesis. So if you're enjoying this series of videos, you're watching live or on replay, please do let me know. It would be really helpful, and then I know that I should sort of keep going with this. At the very start of the video today, I mentioned about Cameron, aka Venus Theory's video, touching a very confrontational subject of copywriting of music and music made with AI, and it sort of made me really realize I like doing this kind of thing, taking a blank wavetable and making it sound like how I want it to sound. But it made me realize that I think we're actually heading into times where having something in your computer that nobody else has, that sound and the ability to make that, could be a very, very powerful tool in your toolbox. And as I said, for me personally, I enjoy this. I have a lot of fun doing it. And we've got this sound with no effects yet, so we can add effects to it. And a whole other concept, which I have done a video on the channel before, where I've taken raw waveforms and we've made them sound better with effects. So the other way, we just took a raw sine wave or sawtooth, and everything that sounds good about it was all to do with the chain of effects. This is basically making your patches sound really good and moving and 3-dimensional right from the get-go. So I'll put a link to that video I speak about of the audio effects, where you can kind of look at that as a different approach. Maybe that suits some of you more, but this is a great approach in my opinion. And as I said, we're tip of the iceberg here. We haven't used oscillator 2, we have a spare envelope, we haven't worked with yet. We haven't added effects, but we've already got something, in my opinion, might not be somebody else's, but I think sounds pretty cool. And it's turned these sort of humble chords into something interesting, right? We've looked at today envelopes, LFOs, the two main modulation sources, the source, destination, that's how we work with those things. We've exposed tremolo and vibrato. They are going on all the time in our world of music, and so we can do that through modulation. And like I said, looking at around here in this screen here, meld, we've got a lot more to unpack with that. Using samples in Wavetable. So what do I mean by that? Well, that could be another whole, you know, really interesting thing to do, where we actually, let's say we scrap this Wavetable and we grab another one just before we wrap up for today, and we'll find that over here. And this is another thing that the Wavetable offers to us. It means it offers to us that we can customize what's going on there. We seem to have had a little crash of sorts there, perhaps. That might be telling me that it's time to wrap things up. Let's do a reopen. Sorry about that, folks. If you are here in the chat with me, we've just had a bit of a crash there. Not sure if the power cut or what happens, but anyway, let's see. Normally restores itself fairly quickly. We might lose the audio for a second though. I'll probably need to make a quick change. But anyway, I was kind of wrapping things up. I also see, while that's happening, something that I saw in the chat last week, comment from Xavi Diaz, which was, it would be nice to see some reverse engineering, how to replicate sounds that we like. That's definitely on the menu for future videos, so hopefully some of you would like to see that. I know Xavi Diaz would, so we're going to, by that I mean we're going to go and like grab somebody's music and listen to how we think they built that sound and how we could build it ourselves. Okay, so there's a few little glitches and pops, but I think we've got Ableton back from that crash. Also Medicinal Soul, haven't seen in the chat today, but also spoke about loving to see how I make a pad with a ton of modulation. So potentially that could be on the menu as well. Why not? Let's do that. So where was I? Adding a new wavetable to another track, which we're doing here. And what I was going to do was just show you, so right now I believe we wouldn't hear Ableton if we play something. Let's just check that. Yep, so we don't. So I'll just make a quick adjustment and then we should be back in business. But like I said, I am kind of on the way to wrapping things up here. So, but let's just get our sound back. All right, after that crash. So now I think we're good again. So Wavetable over here, what we can do with Wavetable is we can add our own sounds into the oscillators. And the crazy thing is this is just a simple vocal sound. It sounds like this. Right, it's a vocal sample. It's now inside this Wavetable on track 12. Let's solo that. So it sounds pretty cool, and if we started to play with some of the things we've looked at already, such as you can almost hear that it has that vocal element to it. So let's even play, I'm playing on my keyboard, but we don't really have to, so. So we've got this lovely sound now with this vocal sample that could be the basis of a pad. So we can look at that in the future. I love snare drums. They can make great pads. This is a vocal sample here. So Wavetable excels again in our locker as a synth. And virtually, if you're using it like a subtractive synth with the basic wave shapes, you know, starting with that, and you're not doing sort of any modulation, that's great. You can use it like that. But I think hopefully what I've just shown you in the last sort of half an hour or 40 minutes is why Wavetable's in our locker and what it kind of excels at. Meld, as I said, we've still got to unpack. Pigments, we can dive deeper in there. FM synthesis with the operator, absolutely, why not? Additive synthesis with the operator, and then our friend the drift, which is kind of like analog, but an up-to-date, more up-to-date version. So it was the last one before Meld, and so it's got maybe a more intuitive interface than analog, and we can see a little bit more visual. There's a few more visual things going on in it. So definitely worth perhaps looking at that as well. So on that note, I'm just going to quickly check the chat there. I think I did see something pop up. Chavit is, what about changing modulation over time depending on where you are in the track? Yes, well, I think you might have come in today at a later point in the video. That's not actually modulation, that's automation. And so modulation kind of does what we've looked at today best, and automation does what you're speaking about there, statically or not so statically, changes over time, and it's more suited to that when you're arranging a track and building tension and release. So if you missed that, head back to earlier in the video where I give right off the bat an example of that and actually show you that if you use automation to kind of do modulation, because you can turn your automation into, particularly in Ableton. So I did an example where I kind of displayed, I'll just quickly go there for a second, but as I said, it's something we already looked at earlier on today. So if we jump down here and we throw our chords into the arrangement view and we look at it here, and we open up the wavetable and we show automation, Ableton gives us, and we click on the filter frequency here. So let's say in this wavetable we say all parameters, click on here, we see the wavetable filter frequency automation lane, and Ableton gives us the ability to insert automation as a bunch of our familiar wavetable shapes, waveforms. And so if we put a sine wave on the filter frequency here and we copy that over, that kind of modulates those chords and modulates the filter, but we've kind of given ourselves something that we could have easily done inside of the patch that we've just been looking at, and now we've blocked ourselves from actually doing something that automation excels at, which would be making a ramp here, perhaps like opening the filter and closing the filter like so. So I hope that helps. As I said, I would very strongly suggest that you go back and check that out, because changing modulation over time would be absolutely on the cards, but then you would be doing that with automation. So this filter here would have modulation going on in the background. So if we actually, let's give you an example of that before we go. Let's go to the other track where we've already got lots of stuff going on. Let's copy the chords over. So in this case of this wavetable, let's maybe give it even another color so it's kind of clear. It should be the instrument that has modulation going on, and in fact it's still not even the best example to use. That would be the one above it, this one I believe. So let's try that. We'll find the best one. Just trying to remember which one has the most modulation in it. No, it is actually the yellow one. Okay, great. So the yellow one here is modulating. So if we loop it up in the arrangement view, that's a good question, so we might as well unpack it a bit here. So if we loop it up inside of here, it's the right one soloed, it's modulating. And it's modulating a lot. But what we could do over time to make changes to that modulation, what would make a lot of sense then would be to turn those targets into automation. So for example, if we put the filter frequency here, it is being modulated, but we're now also automating it. So over time, it's opening up but it's also being modulated. And we can do that with any of these sort of targets in here. That's just one example, right? So we could go to something else and then ask that particular parameter to also be potentially a source of automation. And there's another caveat more to it, and that is modulate the modulator. So we're going to look at that, I think, in part 3 as we go towards turning pro on all of this, because I did have it over here, maybe in my notes somewhere. I believe so, yeah, at the very bottom here, modulating the modulator. So that's another really interesting thing we haven't looked at today. We might have done kind of almost modulating the modulator, but not quite yet. And that is where we actually take LFOs and envelopes and tell another LFO or another envelope, hey, move this. So hope that helps. Reading your response, I was thinking about your approach to automate the envelope modulation over time. Well, again, it's difficult to understand exactly perhaps what you're wanting to see, but the answer would be yes. It's just a question of maybe clarifying the question a little bit more, because I read, what about changing modulation over time? Yes, automation of it, of the same parameter you've modulated, that answers that in my book. And then I was thinking about your approach to automate the envelope modulation over time. So yeah, once again, depending on the synth, we could be taking the amount of that envelope that we're applying and decide to indeed modulate that. But it depends on the synth. In the matrix of, let me just check. Not sure that's a parameter in the wavetable that we can automate, potentially not. But in the analog and some of the others, we can absolutely automate the envelope amount, which is kind of what you said towards the end. So looking forward to the M. Yeah, modulating the modulator. That I understood quite clearly. Yeah, modulating the modulator is lots of fun, guys and girls. So on that note, ran over time a little bit. If you've been here right the way through the stream at some points here and there today, been great to have you all with me. Adrian asked some great questions and answered my quiz questions. Chavi Diaz, as always, thank you for your support. Great to have you in the video and with me in the stream and in the chat. Thank you as always for your ongoing support. And yes, next weekend. So as before, I will, as always, leave a video here that I'd recommend if you've enjoyed this one that you watch next. And I think I will connect you to the audio effects ones where we have a different approach to this, and it's all about adding basic waveforms and turning them into something interesting by applying lots of effects. This was about our turning pro on synthesis, going from beginner to a pro. So we built on part 1 to part 2, part 3. Let's get wild. Awaken the beast and continue to develop this further and further so you can make your own sounds and fresh sounds and enjoy and have fun doing it. So as always, if you've enjoyed the content on the channel, like, comment and subscribe. There's a link in the description where you can buy us a coffee. That's much appreciated, and thank you to those of you who have done that. I'll put a link also in the chat to Venus Theory's video. Mentioned it a couple of times today. Why did I mention it? That's in my video, but I'll put a link to that. Thanks, Cameron, for putting it together. And that's going to be a wrap. Have a great rest of your weekends, Sunday. And of course, I will catch you next weekend in the next live stream at the same time of 3 p.m. Central Eastern Standard Time. Take care of yourselves. Over and out. Ciao for now. Bye, everybody. Ciao, ciao.